Chapter 23 of our book is entitled Human Evolution. We are going to be answering the following questions in this chapter. Go ahead and pause here if you would like to jot them down. We are going to be covering sections 1, 2, 4, and 5. So skipping section 3. Early in the semester, like the very first lecture, we talked about the characteristics that all living things share. But based on the principles of evolution, like natural selection that we'll talk about, that lead to change over time, the current hypothesis about where on our planet life came from, we think that it started from non-living molecules that evolved over time into the life that we know today that has all of those characteristics, which if you think about is very complex. So that would be a lot of small changes over a large amount of time. And we've seen this semester that our bodies are made out of cells, and our cells are made out of large molecules, and that each of those large macromolecules are made of smaller organic molecules, and then all the way down to the elemental level, or the atom. So the current theory or hypothesis about the origin of life is that larger life forms evolved from smaller molecules that developed into larger molecules that came together. And that hypothesis can be shown in 4 phases. Stages 1 through 3 of this hypothesis about the current origin of life theory are considered what we call chemical evolution, because they don't lead to the evolution of living things. We're just going to get all of the pieces together necessary. So stage 1 involves small organic molecules, the monomers that we've talked about, developed from inorganic compounds found in the environment. So this would include the development maybe of individual amino acids or nucleotides. And then in stage 2, those monomers that formed from elements will join together to form polymers, or macromolecules, like a protein being a chain of amino acids, or DNA and RNA being a chain or a polymer of nucleotides. And then in stage 3, those polymers would come together to form what we called a protocell, which enclosed those polymers into an early plasma membrane. And then that formed what is basically like a prototype of a cell. The formation of these protocells is explained because when lipids or fats are available, they tend to orient themselves in the way that we see a plasma membrane structured, that phospholipid bilayer. And then these protocells are still not considered life, though, because they have no mechanism for reproduction or energy production. Reproduction, or the origin of true life, containing all of those elements that we've talked about, comes in the 4th stage of the hypothesis, which we've entitled biological evolution. So stage 4 leads to the development of the first true cell that's capable of DNA replication and exact cell division. And this, we remember, is one of the hallmarks of life. The first early cells were very primitive and did not have all of the enzymatic properties that cells do today. And these processes, those enzymes and their functions, would have developed through further processes of change over time, or what we call evolution. This hypothesis does, however, explain how all of the ingredients to form the first true cell could have come together to give the cell the properties it needs to be considered a life form. So according to this hypothesis of the 4 stages of the origin of life, the first life forms would have been single-cell organisms, and then further change within cells and further evolution would lead to the many diverse forms of life that we see today. And further in this chapter, we'll focus on some of the mechanisms by which that change can happen to lead to new life forms. So if we were in person, I would be asking you guys, what you guys think about the theory of evolution, because there's a lot of kind of pop science and misconceptions that are contained within that word. But we're not together, so I'm just going to tell you. The true theory of evolution from a scientific standpoint has two main tenets. First, all life is descendant from a common ancestor. And that's why we depict the relationships among life forms as being like a tree. Remember, this is called a phylogenetic tree, and organisms that are closer together on the tree, meaning there are fewer branches between them, are more closely related than organisms that are further away or have more branches between them. Since the first tenet of the theory of evolution says that all life is descended from a common ancestor, this common ancestor would be that first true cell that we saw develop during stage 4 of the origin of life. The evidence for this really is the similarities in the cellular functions of all life forms, and that organisms that are more closely related have more similar sequences of DNA than organisms that are considered more distantly related. The second tenet of the theory of evolution says that organisms change over time because they adapt to their environment. So this is the piece of the theory that leads to changes in organisms and eventually the evolution of a new species. And this change over time is explained by the process of natural selection that was proposed by Charles Darwin. And we are going to watch a video in lab this week called The Making of a Theory that will explain the evidence that he saw and collected that led him to this theory of natural selection. So natural selection is the process that causes organisms to become better adapted to their environment, which better gives them a chance of survival and a chance to produce more offspring. So in order for natural selection to occur, there must be two things that are true about a population for natural selection to occur within that population. First, there must be variation within the population. And this means that there's a variation within a particular trait, and that natural selection will affect that trait. So in my example here, we have beetles, and the variation in this population of beetles at the top is color, their phenotype of being different colors. These are all the same species, but some of the beetles in that species are green and some of them are orange. So there is variation within this population. Secondly, there also must be competition for limited resources. So this is really always true when we're talking about communities or organisms living in the same environment or ecosystem. You have to be able to acquire food, water, and shelter in order to be able to mate and pass along your genetic traits. In the case of this example, the selective pressure that's being applied to the beetle population is that they have a predator, which is this blackbird. And when both variation and a selective pressure exist, natural selection will lead to an increase in the trait that makes the organism most suited to their environment. So in our beetle example here, it appears that the orange beetles are less likely to be eaten by the bird. And this could be because they're better camouflaged than the green beetles, or orange is a warning color, so maybe the beetles avoid them. But whatever the reason is, those orange beetles are not being eaten. And because the orange beetles are less likely to be eaten, they're more likely to pass on the genes for an orange phenotype. And eventually, over time, the whole population of beetles will be orange. The species has not changed, but the frequency of that trait has. This is an example of survival of the fittest. The orange beetles were more fit or more able to pass on their genes, so that phenotype is going to prevail within that population. Let's look at a few more examples. Here we have a population of giraffes that are changing over time. So the two things that need to be true for natural selection to occur is that there has to be variation within the population and there has to be selective pressure. So the variation in our giraffe population here is the length of the neck. We have a short-necked giraffe and a longer-necked giraffe. And then the selective pressure would be the ability to reach food. This short-necked giraffe is not going to survive because it's not going to be able to reach food, and if it's not able to feed itself, it's not going to be able to reproduce and pass along its genes for a short neck. And over time, all of the giraffe population will then have longer necks. Another really common example for natural selection is what causes bacteria to become resistant to antibiotics. So if you have a population of bacteria, and all of our yellow dots here, but a mutation occurred to make it resistant to a specific antibiotic. That's the variation that exists within that population. And then when the antibiotic is applied, mostly the resistant bacteria will survive to reproduce, and then more of the antibiotic resistant trait will be passed on. In the resulting population, almost all of the bacteria are resistant to the antibiotic. Bacteria reproduce very quickly, so much more quickly than humans or other animals. So changes in populations can be seen very quickly. In our population, humans, evolution occurs much more slowly, and natural selection occurs much more slowly. So let's look at some of the evidence, the sources of evidence that we have for evolution, since we can't always see natural selection happening in real time, because it happens so slowly. The first thing that we have is the fossil record, the history of life recorded by fossils, which shows that life progressed from the simple to the more complex. So the further down you go, the older an organism is, you're accumulating, as you come up in the fossil record, you're accumulating more and more complex organisms. We also know from the fossil record that aquatic life developed before terrestrial life. As you go further back in time, you're going to find more and more examples of aquatic organisms and fewer examples of terrestrial organisms. And we know that non-flowering plants came before flowering plants, all from the fossil record. Another piece of evidence for evolution and the relatedness of all life forms is that those biochemical processes. All life forms are composed of DNA and RNA molecules. That is what that process of transcription and translation occurs in every single living thing in the same mechanism. That would be a mighty big coincidence unless we inherited that trait and those processes from a common ancestor. Likewise, our sequence of proteins are all made of the same 20 amino acids. Again, that would be a very big coincidence unless we inherited those traits from a common ancestor. And our production of adenosine triphosphate, ATP, for our energy source. That is another thing that we share with most other life forms. Some other examples of some evidence that we can give for evolution is the similarities and relatedness between organisms using comparative anatomy, or basically seeing that many organisms share many of the same anatomical features, even though they may be used differently. So the best explanation for the similarities that we see is that each of those features belonged to a common ancestor and then were passed along from generation to generation, reinforcing that idea of the relatedness among life forms. And these are called homologous structures. They may have been changed over time in each of those populations by natural selection and adaptation to their environment in each of those species because a different selective pressure was applied. Okay, I think I'm going to do our discussion of human evolution in a separate video. So I will see you there.